Here's your host, Chris Cooper.
Hello, this is Chris Cooper, and a big welcome to the Business Elevation Show on Voice America. It's great to be back with you again for another amazing week. We've got a great guest today. We're going to be talking to Chantel Prat very shortly about neuroscience. Wherever you are in the world, some of you may be on holiday, you might be celebrating Good Friday and off, but we're keeping going today with Chantel. I've had an incredible few days. I've been out in Poland took my eldest son on a sort of business trip out there, but also a nice social time too. I spent a wonderful time with Pavel and Magdalena in Warsaw. Now, Pavel and Magdalena are composers, and Pavel is an incredible composer. So we had a wonderful time and explored Warsaw, and I learned all sorts of things about an incredible city which literally elevated itself from the ruins. It was like a phoenix that had to recover after World War II. Incredibly, 1.3 million people lived in Warsaw before the Nazi invasion. Afterwards, there were 900,000 still alive, and only 1,000 were able to live in the city because it was completely and utterly destroyed. And since then, the city has been literally rebuilt and brick by brick, and it is now very beautiful. You realize still the impact of what's going on in Ukraine and how that makes people feel in Poland. But an absolutely amazing example of human ability to recover when things are tough. And whatever's going on in your life right now, if life is tough for you, I think Warsaw is a great example. And if you read and learn a little bit about that, about new beginnings, about rebuilding when maybe tragedy or difficulty strikes, and being resilient. And I think as we all step up and work towards contributing to a better world through our work, and I hope, and the show is about that, about business stepping up and elevating themselves and contributing to being part of the solution and not the problem, then we can use Warsaw as inspiration. So today I'd like to talk with my guest today and introduce you to Chantel Prat. We're going to talk about Neuroscience Unveiled, and we're going to discuss some insights for understanding yourself and others. This is going to be really fascinating because I'm talking to somebody who's a real expert at neuroscience. Chantel is a professor at the University of Washington. She's had appointments in the departments of psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, and the Institutes for Learning and Brain Sciences. Her CV here is really bio is quite involved, so I'm going to look at my notes here to be able to do that because there's a few sort of quite technical words and things in here. But Chantel has a real understanding of our neural mechanisms, an understanding of how these impact on our language and our higher executive functions. She's had lots of awards. Tom Drabasso Young Investigator Award, Pathway to Independence Award. She is supported by the National Institute of Health, the Office of Naval Research, and the Keck Foundation. And she's actually in a documentary called I Am Human, which you can check out, which looks really interesting. I'm going to watch this over the weekend, I think. And she's profiled in loads and loads of media, from Psychology Today to Pacific Standard and the National Public Radio, and you name it, Chantel's been on it. So a big welcome to my guest today, to Chantel Prat.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to add, you were talking about inspiration and lifting yourself up when things get hard. And when it comes to the brain, I just want to say, inspiration literally means to breathe in. And most people don't know this, but do you know that your brain uses 25% of your body's oxygen? So when you need inspiration, sometimes the simple act of taking a deep breath can be a very straightforward way to energize you, literally, to do the hard things that your brain needs to do.
That's a really interesting and helpful fact, actually, because I talk, I may have mentioned to you, I talk about inspiration and motivation and energy and also the importance of breathing. I'm not sure how well I breathed before this interview. Um, Now thinking about it, but you're absolutely right. It's hugely important, isn't it?
Well, sometimes inspiration can seem so, you know, invisible and elusive, but we have it. I mean, we can call on our bodies to energize our brains and dig in a very accessible way. What I love about that is that everybody breathes, so it's available instantly.
Because we breathe too shallowly generally, don't we? Particularly if we're anxious.
Correct. That's right.
So well, actually, what we're doing is we're starving our brain of oxygen, or the potential.
Correct. And the rest of our body, but our
Yeah,
brain's the greedy one who needs a lot.
yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background, and how did you decide you wanted to become a neuroscientist at a very young age, or was this something that you learned about as you were growing up and evolved for you?
Well, as at a very young age, I think I wanted to be a cowboy. And then growing up, I was very much in the process of going to medical school. Um, and I really think that like many people, I sort of defaulted into, oh, what does success look like? What are the respectable jobs in the world? And I was, well into my pre-med education when I had one class to take. I had to take one social science class as a prerequisite. And I found a class just out of convenience. It was a psychology class merely because it fit in with my schedule, taking these accelerated pre-med classes, selling shoes. I was doing a lot of different
Mhm.
things at the time. And I remember the instructor on the first day of class told the story of Phineas Gage, who was a railway worker in the early 1900s, who survived an accident in which a railway spike was blown through the front of his brain. And in telling the story, the teacher explained that he was changed. This accident changed his personality. And here I was in this pre-med class studying, in these pre-med courses, taking biology and chemistry and organic chemistry and learning about how, the lungs are this organ, going back to oxygen, that, bring oxygen from the world to the blood, and the heart pumps that oxygenated blood through the body. And then you have this organ that is the human brain that turns that oxygenated blood into the energy that creates every thought and feeling and behavior that you identify with as yourself. And that if you change that system, you change yourself. And it was like being struck by lightning. I was like, this is the thing I want to understand. I want to understand how the brain, not how the brain works on average or how brains work in general, but how your brain makes you, how differences in the way our brains work scale up to the ways that we understand the world and our place in it.
Mm.
And here I am,
And
still trying to figure it out.
here you are. I also, I know one of the things you also love is horses.
That's right. Yeah. The cowgirl thing didn't leave. I bought my first, I started taking lessons actually when I was 30. I bought my first horse. And it's interesting because I think horsemanship has enhanced. I mean, I think that horsemanship and my understanding of the brain enhance one another reciprocally, because I think with our pets, we make some of the same mistakes we make with one another. We understand them through our own lens.
Mm.
When it's animals, we call it anthropomorphization, putting human-like characteristics onto animals. But you hear people all the time saying, oh, my dog or my horse is manipulating me, or they're trying to this. And they're simply just not, they don't have the capacity, they don't move through the world in these ways. They see, think, and feel differently. And I think by learning to see my horses as they are and to interact with them, to separate my stuff from the way they're behaving, I have learned a lot about how to be with people and also how to notice nonverbal, communication in people. which has been really powerful.
Mm. So how does the brain of a horse or a dog differ to a human brain?
Oh, I have monthly musings on my social media, and I did a whole thing about this. And what I think is fascinating is that both horses and dogs kind of co-evolved with humans and have been central to our civilization and our progress. But horse and dog are so different from one another in a critical way that, well, we all share something in common, that we're social animals, that we evolved, humans, dogs, and horses all evolved to solve problems collectively and to interact in a pack, as opposed to something like a donkey, which is more solitary. But horses and humans are predators. I'm not horses, dogs and humans are predators.
Mm.
And this gives even the littlest chihuahua this kind of confidence in their interactions with humans that horses don't have. Horses are prey animals. And even as compared to a cow that has horns, a horse's primary defense is to notice what's happening in the herd and what's happening around them and to run. So when you think about, their brains are set up for these jobs, and they're set up to be social. They're set up for mirror social learning. But they're also, like dogs and horses, are so different because of this fundamental relationship between safety and survival. And so when you think about the fact that a horse is a large animal that makes humans feel very vulnerable, and
Yeah.
so many people are afraid of horses, but their nature is to survive by noticing threat and running away. When you think about the fact that an animal like that will choose to partner with a human and ride into war, it's such an incredible, you talk about inspiration. For
Mm.
me, that's such an incredible model of what relationship can be, and trust and connection.
So it's really that they're in that situation, they're going against their basic instincts to
Mm-hmm.
do that. But the relationship is what
Carries them through.
Course, yeah.
And I think in the very classical dressage and classical ideas of horsemanship, through which like cavalry and these kinds of riding evolved, were very patient, very kind, very thorough, and involved a lot of time together between the trainer and the horse. And I think that something we've lost as a culture is that willingness to be patient and to work in a consensual way with an animal and to build that trust, because it's far too easy to do a dominance kind of training, a fear-based training, to try and get to the end before moving through that trust space. And that's why I think the horses are really great teachers for me.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, you got me thinking about my dog. I think we're probably a bit too soft with her. I think she probably partly thinks she's human, I think. Getting a line
Well,
on
they
the
have our pets, for better or for worse, have their own set of needs and wants and motivations, right? And sometimes they conflict with our own. And so I think that it's worth, I mean, again, I think it's a great practice for human beings and for animals. It's worth thinking, how can I, serve this being's need in a way that isn't, against isn't conflicting with the ways that the things that I need, rather than just trying to turn them into what you need, finding this compromise and
Yeah, I really do get that. I really get that as a dog owner, finding that compromise and letting them, realizing things like, when you go out for a walk, that is their one time to be free, isn't it? One time. So, allowing them to run, allowing them to, and not trying to squeeze them into the walk into 10 minutes, and because actually it's important to them, to the quality of their life. So, how would you describe your work today?
Today, I'm going back to that young person who was on the path to medicine and wanted to find out how brains make us us. I would say I've spent the last 25 years trying to develop the science for understanding the relationship between the mind and the brain at the level of the individual. So I got hooked fast and hard on neuroscience. And then I learned that most people who study neuroscience study simpler creatures than humans, like a fruit fly or a roundworm or a zebrafish, because they want to know how brains work. And there's enough in common with those species and us that you can get pretty far. But I wanted to understand how humans work, which is, really, really complicated and messy. And because humans are so complicated, the vast majority of science that you will read about in books or in journal articles takes the average of a lot of different people's brain functioning and describes the relationship between the mind and the brain using statistical averages. So the ways that people in any sample might differ from one another are treated like measurement error or noise. But we know this isn't true. I mean, so if you're a parent, if you're a team leader, if you have siblings, I think if you're awake and behaving human, you realize that people have sort of different operating systems, however you want to talk about it, right? Different engines driving them. And in my dissertation, what I realized is that sometimes those statistical averages aren't just sort of fuzzy or incomplete descriptions of how the brain gives rise to the mind. Sometimes they're completely incorrect. So if you have 2 or 3 different ways of doing things and you're taking an average of those different ways to describe human behavior, the average may not describe any person
Yes.
in the group at all. So, and in fact, that was, I was looking at how people read between the lines and make inferences when they're reading a story and how the 2 hemispheres of the brain collaborate to do that. And we had this idea about what happens, and nobody actually worked like that. There were these different patterns that kind of gave rise to that average. So I've been working in the field of learning and cognition. I'm most recently doing a lot of work on how people come to master programming languages, and why is that so hard for some people? Why is it easier for others? What are the sort of learner training conditions that support learning? And most recently, this is something I'm really excited about, and I think something that all of your listeners have instant access to. I have a new grant from the Department of Defense looking at self-efficacy, or how our beliefs about our own learning can sort of trump or override our actual capabilities. And so looking to see if we can teach people how they learn, like personalized neuroscience of learning, so that they can actually put themselves in the driver's seat when it goes to trying to learn something new. Because if you think you're bad at something, it turns out that's the biggest predictor of how well you're going to do, even if you're not actually bad at that thing.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now, I meet people on the show who see the show and outside who speak 6 languages. And for me, learning language was always difficult. Now, I think it was easier learning French when I was spending a lot of time in France, much easier. But actually, I find it difficult. My kids are really quite bright, but they both found learning languages difficult. So how much is nature and how much is kind of nurture and technique?
That's a great question. So one really cool thing we've done in our lab is show that I can record your brain activity with, if you just close your eyes and I listen to the electrical activity on your scalp for 5 minutes, I can predict with about 60 to 70% accuracy, or 60 to 70% of the variability, which is a lot, in how easily it will be for you to learn a natural language. So there's a lot there in your sort of patterns of neural firing that speaks to how readily you'll pick up a natural language. So but those patterns are shaped by your previous experiences as well as the way you were born. And the trick is, even if I can predict 60 to 70% or 50%, the vast majority of the rest of that is motivation. So you said, for me, learning a language is hard. And here's the trick. Learning a language is hard for everybody. I am 100% convinced. Learning a language is hard. Learning a programming language is hard. Learning all of the desirable skills in the world is hard for everybody. And so the question then becomes one of motivation. So you're saying when you were in France, like learning French is hard, but if you have a croissant right in front of you and
Yes.
knowing how, or a beautiful person, or, something like that, you have a relationship or a business, your brain harnesses the motivation to work through that hard. And that motivation, the croissant or the beautiful person or the business, getting the business off the ground, all of those pieces of motivation work in your dopamine system. Dopamine is our reward, but it's also our motivation cue. And the cool thing about dopamine is that it also facilitates plasticity in the brain. So if you come against something hard and you go, I'm not good at language, your brain dips dopamine. It tells you this is not going to be rewarding for you in the future. And it makes it harder. But if you're like, this is hard, but worth it. I really want to learn this thing. Or like, it's not that I'm bad at this, but that this task is hard. This is kind of like a growth mindset, right? The way that the growth mindset works is this, like, you have a hard experience, your brain layers a story on top of it. And that story then drives motivation or avoidance, which then drives your neurochemistry, which makes it actually easier or harder to do the thing you're trying to do. So language is like, you just gave me the perfect example for this, to lay out how your capabilities may not be as important as the story you tell yourself about
Really
it.
true. I have another example where, on the opposite, where I said to myself, I decided that I was going to be able to, by the time I was 40, play the electric guitar and blow everybody away. I on my birthday, and that was one of the things that happened on my 40th birthday, was I played it. But what I decided was, each time because I started playing about 15, age 15, I think, but just picked it up and then dropped it for a few years and picked it up. But I decided that I would restart again. But each time I did, I imagined that I was a brilliant guitar player. And
That's
I tried
beautiful.
to mind to be a brilliant guitar player. And I do play the guitar, electric guitar, well now. And but a friend of mine started at the same time, and just found me incredibly frustrating, because he would be, oh, I'm no good at this, I'm not good at that. And he'd come to me and they get demoralized, could see how much I was. I said, look, just imagine you're a great guitar player. But, oh, I can't, I'm rubbish, and he never made progress with it. But I think,
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And I think the other piece of this is that when you're watching your kids learn a language, or when your friend is watching you play the guitar, the effort is invisible. Like, they don't know, or like you're on a Duolingo league and you're losing or whatever. Like, you don't necessarily know. So some part of it is motivation and the joy that you bring, which seems like you like hacked into that in such a great way. And some part of it is just that part of what we use to decide if we're good at something is the social comparison, but you don't see that person's effort. You don't know how hard they work to get there. And so that can be tricky too.
so when you do, I assume that, during all of your study and your training, you examined human brains, physically, you must have spent time with human brains. How different is a human brain? I mean, is it as different as when you look at somebody, we look different, which is incredible. Is there a lot of variation physically in a human brain, as well as in the way that it fires and works together?
Yes. So the question is, how different are human brains from one another?
Yeah.
Right. So for me, yeah, the answer is yes. So like when I was talking about these recording brain activity from when people close their eyes and rest, and using it to predict language learning, these are neural oscillations, or every brain has a characteristic set of frequencies that it communicates over. I think talking about guitar, you'll be into that. I think it's very cool. We have like an orchestration of signals in our brain, and those are about as unique as a human fingerprint. Like, you can identify someone who comes back over and over based on these patterns of frequencies over which their brains communicate. So at that, if you look at, that's brain function. And most typically developing brains have all the same parts, more or less, right? But when you zoom into the level that matters for understanding the world, yes, the answer is yes. They look as different as our faces from one another. And more, or maybe not more importantly, but equally importantly, our brains differ. They change in a day, in a minute. They change when I'm talking to you right now. If any of this leaves a lasting impression, there's physical changes in your brain. And even though you have this sense of stability of identity, over the lifespan, our brains change from one another, and so do our ways of understanding the world and our place in it. So, I think that there are dramatic differences, and they shape the way we take in information.
So we're just a couple of minutes before commercial break now. But so why is neuroscience so important when it comes to understanding people in the workplace?
Yeah, great question. So for me, I think it's really important to understand that a behavior can be driven by different pathways. So I started my career understanding reading skill and reading struggle, and learning about the brain could help me understand why someone could score the same, score on a test, or struggle at the same level in reading for different reasons. Maybe they have difficulty with phonology or memory, or maybe they just need more practice. Maybe it's more experience. And I think in the workplace, being able to reverse engineer two behaviors that might look the same, but be driven by differences in experience, differences in motivation, the paths, the engine that drives these behaviors can give you a lot of power to understanding the person and where they're coming from.
So is this that the awareness that actually we are all very different and our human, I guess there's some commonalities and patterns, but appreciating that how, there's physical reason and learning reason as to why somebody might behave differently in a different situation or bring a different skill and different abilities. We are all a blend of uniqueness.
That's right. That's right. And I will answer that in more detail because I see that we have 1 minute. But, I guess I would just say the best thing about learning about brains is to get a level of humility about your sense of what is true.
Yeah.
And learning to understand how much inference making every brain does with incomplete information.
Mm-hmm. Well, that has been absolutely fascinating. So we're going to go to commercial break now, and we'll be back again in just a couple of minutes. So do get yourself a cold drink or something, and maybe a notepad and a bit of paper, 2 or 3 key points that you've taken away from today that could be useful in your work, in whatever you do, in understanding yourself and in understanding others. There are often real golden nuggets in these conversations, and I'm expecting there'll be more after the break. So do join us in just a couple of minutes.
You are tuned into the Business Elevation Show with your host, Chris Cooper. If you have a question or comment about our show, please direct your emails to chris@chriscooper.co.uk. That's chris@chriscooper.co.uk. Now back to Chris Cooper.
Hi, this is Chris Cooper. I'm with Chantel Prat, and we're talking about neuroscience, and we're talking about really how this is relevant in our lives and in the workplace. And one, I think important conversation we were having in planning this show was around the importance of curiosity. Do you want to explain why curiosity is so essential when it comes to being innovative and professionally growing, for example? Why having a curious mind is an advantage?
Absolutely. Well, I think we all understand that curiosity is pleasant, and that it fosters these kind of change and innovation that are often at the sort of core of some big pivot that people are looking for. But what are the conditions, and how neuroscience can actually teach you how to foster curiosity is, I think, something people know less about. So, and I guess I will connect to what we were just talking about, which is like, why is neuroscience so important in the workplace? I'll use this as case study, if you will, about how curiosity can actually help us to connect and be better teams and better leaders with one another. Because I think something that can be quite difficult is fostering curiosity about another person who works differently than you. So let me start with this. Our brain is massively powerful and massively energetically demanding, but it exists in an infinite world that is constantly changing, and it is finite. So we perceive the world as if our eyes are a movie camera and we're taking in all of the information and we're moving around with a high degree of confidence that we understand what's going on around us. But I think the very biggest trick our brain plays on us is to remove uncertainty, is to give us the illusion that the reality that it is creating for us based on incomplete snapshots of this infinite physical world and huge amount of filling in the blanks about what must be going on based on what it expects to be going on based on our previous experiences. It does all of this filling in the blanks, and it gives us a sense that we see the world as it is and not as we expect it to be. And I think that while many people have a level of humility, not enough, but many have a level of humility about more complex notions like equality and freedom and things like that, and that can mean something different to different people, I think we dramatically underestimate the ambiguity in words, for instance, in memory, in the things that we take away from an experience and how much that's driven by our brains and our statistical models based on our own lifetimes of experiences. And I think that when you dig into your version of the truth is the truth, you miss the opportunity to see the world from a different perspective, from a different person with a different set of lived experiences and these different biological filters. And here's where curiosity can really open you and allow you to live 2 lives or 3 lives or 6 lives or however many lives you're willing to engage with that come up with a different answer than you do, right? The trick is that there are certain spaces where curiosity is easier to foster than others, because before our brains give us the feeling of curiosity, the first step to feeling curious is being in a situation where you don't think you know the answer. If I give you a trivia question and you're 98% confidence you know the answer, your curiosity level is going to be 0 to 2%, right? So the first step to curiosity is you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a prediction or your prediction failed. And you might have an opportunity there to be really bummed out or to be curious, like, why did it fail, right? So if you think you know the answer, you're not open to curiosity. If you find yourself in a situation where you don't know the answer, there's an opportunity for curiosity. But the very next step that the brain engages in is assessing safety. So psychological safety, physical safety. If you were in the real world and you find yourself in a neighborhood you don't know, the first thing your brain is going to do is say, do I feel safe? If you were in the woods, ancestrally, we were in a new place in the world, do I think there are predators here? Is this a safe place to explore and look for food? So that safety assessment happens before your brain makes you feel curious. It's only when you say, okay, I don't know. Number one, I don't know. Number two, this is a safe place to explore, that your brain gives you the feeling of curiosity, which once again is underpinned by all this dopamine that motivates you to explore and opens you to learn from the experiences that come from those explorations. And when we're put in front of somebody who doesn't work like us, if the ways that they don't work like us feel like a threat to our identity or our sense of self, the brain protects that so strong. We all know this. We can feel this inside of us, and we can sense it in someone else who we might be trying to get to see the world like us. Identity and the beliefs we hold that are central to our identity are things that our brains protect in the same way it would protect our physical safety. No, I was just saying, in the workplace, I think that psychological safety and having, not only when understanding one another, but when exploring something that didn't go well, and the opportunity to learn from that, psychological safety is a condition. It's a prerequisite for curiosity. So if you're in a room and everybody's trying to have the right answer and people aren't exploring alternatives, you might ask about the culture there around mistakes and being right and knowing the answer and how that might be antithetical to supporting curiosity in the brain.
Yes. Yes. I think that's so important because we all been in situations where, two people are falling out over what is right and what is wrong, but it's often not as clean cut as that, is it? And what can happen too if you've got people who are very much, fighting for that, and I'm right and you're wrong. The curiosity, but also the creativity goes out the window. So someone maybe who's on the narcissistic spectrum can actually limit a lot of creativity and suppress it.
That's exactly right. I just learned that narcissism is positively correlated with the what is it? I would say self-fulfilling prophecy, but what I really mean is that the confirmation bias. So narcissists are more likely to turn down information when it comes in that's inconsistent with their beliefs about the world. Everybody, we hear about the confirmation bias in everybody, but it's not as strong in everybody. Again, we don't all work the same, right? So the more wedded you are to being right, or, to things being about you, the less you're actually seeing the objective truth.
Yeah. What about people who people who talk at you, and rather than listen? So, I have experience, and I've got a few people in my network who, it's hard to get a word in, and you just close down. I think, but it's not necessarily about being right or wrong with them. But it can become very, very frustrating. I do have somebody I know quite well, and I don't think he'll listen to this show, but I have actually fallen asleep twice while he's been speaking to me. Only person I've ever done it before, but get late in an evening and you maybe come at 10 o'clock at night and they're still talking at you 40 minutes later, and I'm afraid my brain just switches off.
Yeah. That's a great example of when I hear that, I don't have as much context as you do, right? But that's a great example of a behavior that I think could be driven by different kind of engineering. And I have experienced that as well. And I'm always trying, even like when I'm on this podcast and I'm your guest, I'm like, oh, talking too much, take turns. Some people that it could come from loneliness. This person has had all of these ideas building up in their brain, and it's like looking for an outlet. And some of the times that happens to me, it's a person who I can then come to realize is like, it's like my thoroughbred racehorse who was born to run a race. And every time she started running, it was like, I might never get to run again. It's like a pressure valve, and they have all these ideas, but they don't realize that it's not interactive and that you need sips of ideas to like exchange back and forth. It could happen because of like a more narcissistic personality and that they really don't care what you think. But like those are two really different, explanations for a similar behavior, right? And so that's where the curiosity could come in. Like, why, what does this person need? It's clearly not my opinion on whatever they're saying.
Yeah. That's because you're right. Some people may just want to talk and may just want you to listen. But if you're somebody who also has views and opinions, it can be quite hard, can't it? It can be quite painful and and sapping. So any strategies for people to, when we talked about curiosity, to be able to kind of really effectively pilot their own minds? We talked a little bit about positivity, but also you were talking about, negativity and perceiving risk earlier on. And actually, some people do see the world in a slightly negative. It motivates them. It's like it's a way versus forward motivation. So how do we understand what's right? Positivity versus more of a negative approach, and do we need a where should the the line be?
So the beginning of the question was very general and important. It's like how to pilot your brain, or I like to think about it as how to partner with your brain, right? Like how to understand your own proclivities and best and best what move, because that's a question that people ask me, like, do I try then to compensate for my weaknesses? Do I lean into my strengths? And in the book I wrote, The Neuroscience of You, I give people tools for actually figuring out how their own brains work. And in it, I think one of the really important things that I kind of repeat over and over is that these different ways that our brains work, whether it be motivation, that was the specific question you're asking, like what motivates us through hard time, or whether it's like these, bigger picture things like how our two hemispheres work, which I'm happy to talk about too. I like to think that there's a trade-off and that brains occupy different spaces in this information trade-off because we evolved to solve problems collectively in groups, right? And so I think appreciating how your brain works can help you in a lot of ways to understand what you might be missing. Doesn't mean that you need to be different. It just gives you a better perspective on how your brain is sensing the world and what motivates you. And I think that is, like I said, our brains reduce the uncertainty so quickly and so elementally that understanding that at a conceptual level can help you see what you might be missing. And I think that's really not only that, but also what is your own lens that you're putting onto others, like what is actually not in the world, but in you. When you understand that piece, you can actually, it's kind of like translating English to English or whatever language people speak, right? When they speak the same language, but are coming through a different lens, you can subtract the part that is you and see the other person. And I think that something we do all the time, we talked about this with our pets, is we see other people through our own lens, and that makes it easier to get along with people who work like us. And then we see someone who doesn't work like us and we think, wow, this person is an idiot, or they make terrible choices, or like, how could they think that is true? The dress is white and gold, the dress is blue and black, freedom is this. So my tips are learn the various ways that brains differ. And when it comes to curiosity, can you imagine an operating system that would lead that person's behavior that you disagree with to be a valid choice that their brain is making based on their lifetime of experiences and their engineering?
Yeah. Yes. So one thing I just is sort of coming up into my mind is I'm having come back from my travels. I one night with only 3 hours of sleep, so I'm just playing catch up as well. So my brain may be at the moment, but I'm intrigued. I often think of when I'm working with people, I notice how stories in their life have a huge impact. A story can be very motivating, but also stories about things can be very, very limiting. So it might be as simple as you mentioned. I remember someone telling me, "Oh, I'm not very good at maths," but actually, the profiling it did suggested maybe they could be a lot better at it than they realized. But there can be stories about, people have had relationships that haven't worked out, so they assume the next one and the next one's not going to either, or somebody's attracted to a certain type of person that always ends up in disaster. It's a repeat. So how important are stories to the way that our brains function and our behavior?
They're so important. So the prevalence of this layer, this is probably a uniquely human thing. I'm always really, really hesitant, but this is probably a uniquely human thing to wrap our experiences in this layer of interpretive story consciousness, our conscious layer of story. So I talked about inference and interpretation before and how we make sense with incomplete information, but the story is the piece that we're conscious of. The things that drive us are largely subconscious, but the power of the conscious story is huge. And that's because the human brain has this capability to reprogram its sort of more basic instincts and ways of understanding the world on the fly with a story. I mean, I think of story as an instruction, an entertaining, motivational instruction. So like if I were to say to my kids, eat your vegetables, like meh, or like vegetables are good for you, meh. But if I were to tell a story about how this like hero saved the world's puppies by eating vegetables, and it's like a motivated instruction, a very long instruction. And so if I were to say to you, every time I say the word story, you should blink your eyes 3 times or something like that. There's nothing in your previous lived experiences that make that rewarding or a good idea, but language and story and the human brain can now make instantly. And with one turn, you could blink your eyes 3 times every time I say story. You can reprogram other things that you know the word story, you know how to blink your eyes. You can merge those together. So those conscious stories that we tell are like a map. I think of the navigational systems, the ways that we learn from experience are things that compete to control our behavior. But the story is like a map saying, turn left when you get to blah, blah, blah. And it can override different ways of knowing. So I think it's incredible. And the story is so prevalent that we have special words to talk about things like flow that occur when we actually are just responding to the world and just seeing what is, or mindfulness without the story. And by the way, there are 2 sides to every story. There are 2 parts of the human brain that are involved in creating and evaluating these why stories. And I think that's fascinating. In most typically right-handed people, there's an area of the brain near the part that controls speech. Michael Gazzaniga called this the interpreter, that's constantly trying to connect events in your life with a story. I call it a why story. The scientists call it causal inferencing. This happened and then this happened. I wore these socks and I won the game. These are my lucky socks, right? Or I smiled at Chris and he smiled back. Smiles are contagious. Like those are, different kinds of why stories, but those are the things that your brain is doing all the time. It's connecting, it's telling you why these 2 separable events can be causally related to one another. And then there's a part of the brain in the opposite hemisphere, approximately parallel in the front. These are both in the frontal lobe, whose job it is to evaluate this bridge that you've connected, because there are often many, many, many different interpretations of why 2 things might be related. And this part of the brain considers the broader context of what's going on and the big picture. And it decides like this, yes, if I connect event A with event B with this bridge, this causal story, it makes sense in the grand scheme of things. Or it can reject that idea. Like, oh, it's kind of like you find a piece of a puzzle and the shape is right, but when you stick that piece in, you have like an eyeball in the middle of a tree or something. Like the right hemisphere says, nope, that piece might fit connecting A and B, but when I open up to what's going on around me right now, or, based on my understanding of the world, it doesn't fit. So you can actually, there's some really cool research saying that you can tell whether someone is a skeptic or a supernatural believer by how these 2 halves of the brain work together. And particularly if somebody's going to make a connection between 2 like random experimentally architected events, the right hemisphere is quieter in supernatural believers than in skeptics, who may overly reject hypotheses that could link things in the real world. So that was a very long answer because I really care about why stories. And I would encourage you all to be scientists of yourself and examine and do what scientists do. Not only look for evidence that your why story is true, but look for evidence that your why story is false.
Right. Good. Cool. I've got so many more questions I want to ask you. I have three that I wanted to ask, and I've got 3 minutes left, so I'm not going to be able to do that.
Speed round.
Actually, these questions are quite big ones. Like how much of our actual thinking goes on in our brain, is because people talk about, intelligence in your gut and places like that. Lots of time on that, I'm sure. Maybe we need to get you back again and at some point in the future.
I would love to come back.
So we've got just a couple of minutes. So do you have any final messages that you'd like to share with us?
I guess, in line with what you were saying about thinking and where it comes from, I guess I would say two things. One is check on your why stories about your own learning, going back to the research I'm doing now, particularly when there's something that you want to achieve, but you're telling yourself that you're not good at it. I think you can re-examine, like we have done today, anecdotally, like where does my evidence that I'm not good at it come from? And also, like, I necessarily must be not good at this thing when I start, and that's okay. The question is, am I interested enough to keep working until I get better at it? So think about that. And I would say the second thing is, I think one of the things that will heal the world is if we get a little bit more humble about our versions of the truth and understand that our brains are removing uncertainty and learn to be curious about other people who see the world through different experiences and different brains. I think we can learn a lot and open up opportunities to connect. Well,
I can see that at the highest levels of political leadership across the globe right now would make an enormous amount of difference. More humility and more wisdom and more listening is what we need, rather than falling out, anger and getting into conflict. So I'll leave the show now. We've only got 30 seconds left. It's been brilliant talking to you, Chantel. Thank you so much. I've loved our conversation. It's gone far too quick. If you want to find out more about Chantel, chantelprat.com. You can also check out online brain games and the Neuroscience of You. You mentioned sound like a good read for anybody interested in this area. Any questions or comments? Do get in touch. If you want to connect with me on the likes of LinkedIn and different social media, let me know where you've heard from me, because get so many, and a lot of people just try and connect and don't say why. And I'm sure same with Chantel. Lots more guests lined up in the next few weeks, so do continue to join us. And what we're doing now is we're starting to put these onto YouTube, so you'll be able to actually Chantel in action in a few days online if you want to see us, rather than just listen to us on Voice America or on Google, Apple, etc. So do check out my YouTube for that. And take everybody, go away, have a think, check out your stories. And stories about your own learning. Think about your curiosity, and make sure you're not restricting conversation and stopping other people's creativity. Let's all get more humble. Let's all get more humble and hear other people's versions and not just our own. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.